I was the shadow of my older brother, so I enrolled at UCL to stay out of sight, and when I achieved success, I returned, invested $5 million, and then, growing up as Robert Carter's younger brother had always been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it opened doors, gave me access to a world that most people could only dream of. But on the other, it was a constant reminder that I was never quite enough. No matter what I did, Robert was always there, casting his long shadow over my achievements, reminding me that I was merely second best. Robert was a powerhouse in New York City, a successful businessman who had made his fortune by building an empire from the ground up. He was the golden child, the prodigy, the son who could do no wrong. And then there was me, James Carter, the younger brother who tried and failed to live up to an impossible standard. I had excelled in my studies, sure, but even that wasn't enough. My grades, my academic accomplishments, my small victories, none of it mattered in comparison to Robert's accomplishments. I was always the other Carter, the one people forgot about as soon as Robert walked into the room. I was tired of it, tired of the comparisons, the expectations, the constant feeling of inadequacy that gnawed at me. I knew I had to get away, to find a place where I could carve out my own identity without being overshadowed by my brother's success. That's when I decided to drop out of my local college and go somewhere far from Robert's sphere of influence. It took weeks of persuasion, countless arguments, and more than a few heated discussions, but eventually, my parents agreed to let me go. I convinced them that I needed this, that I couldn't breathe in Robert's shadow anymore. I needed a fresh start, a place where I could be more than just Robert Carter's younger brother. And so, with a hefty tuition payment of around £27,000 per year, I enrolled at University College London, one of the UK's top universities, promising my parents that I would excel. When the day finally came to leave, my parents stood on the doorstep, watching as I loaded my luggage into the taxi. My mother was teary-eyed, clutching a handkerchief as she hugged me one last time. "James, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes, Mom," I replied, forcing a smile. "I need this. I need to do this for myself." My father, always the stoic one, patted my shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Just remember, James, this is your chance to prove yourself. Don't let us down." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat as I climbed into the taxi. As we pulled away, I glanced back at my parents, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I was leaving behind everything I had ever known, venturing into the unknown. But for the first time, I felt a spark of hope, a sense that I was finally taking control of my own life. Arriving in London was a culture shock like nothing I had ever experienced. The city was grand, ancient, and modern at the same time. A place where history and progress collided in a dizzying array of sights, sounds, and smells. I wandered the streets, taking in the towering buildings, the bustling crowds, the red double-decker buses, and the black cabs that seemed to be everywhere. It was overwhelming, yet exhilarating. I felt small, but in a good way, as if I were a single drop in an ocean of possibilities. My first day at UCL was equally overwhelming. The campus was sprawling and beautiful, a blend of neoclassical architecture and sleek modern buildings that made me feel as if I were stepping into a different world. I met students from all over the globe, people whose backgrounds were as varied as the city itself. They were wealthy, confident, and utterly at ease in this world of privilege and opportunity. For the first time, I felt like I was on the edge of something great, something that was entirely my own. I quickly realized that London was a city that thrived on connections, on who you knew and how well you played the game. And so, I threw myself into the social scene, attending parties, networking events, and gatherings at exclusive clubs where the city's elite came to see and be seen. I met people who owned businesses, politicians, and even a few minor celebrities. It was intoxicating, the sense of being part of a world that was far removed from anything I had known back in New York. One of the first people I met was a fellow student named Oliver. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with a British accent that seemed to drip with privilege. He introduced me to his circle of friends, a group of young men and women who were all wealthy, well-connected, and completely at ease in London's high society. "You're from New York?" Oliver asked, raising an eyebrow as we sipped our drinks at a rooftop bar overlooking the city. Yeah, I replied, trying to sound casual. I needed a change of pace. Oliver nodded, a knowing smile playing at his lips. I get that. London's the perfect place to reinvent yourself. People here respect ambition. That was exactly what I needed to hear. For the first time, I felt like I was in a place where my ambitions weren't overshadowed by my brother's success, where I could make a name for myself on my own terms. Over the next few weeks, I immersed myself in this new world, learning the unspoken rules, the subtle cues that separated the insiders from the outsiders. I attended black tie events, dined at exclusive restaurants, and spent my weekends at country estates, rubbing shoulders with people whose wealth and influence were almost unimaginable. I began to see London as a city of endless opportunities, a place where I could finally step out of Robert's shadow and forge my own path. I threw myself into my studies with a determination that surprised even me, balancing my academic pursuits with my newfound social life. I knew I had a lot to prove, not just to my family, but to myself. I had to show that I could succeed on my own, that I was more than just the younger brother of a successful businessman. But even as I settled into this new life, there was a part of me that couldn't escape the nagging feeling that I was still running from something. I had come to London to escape Robert's shadow, but in some ways, it felt like that shadow had followed me. I was still driven by the need to prove myself, to show that I could be just as successful, just as accomplished as he was. As I navigated the world of UCL and London's high society, I began to realize that I was no longer just trying to escape my brother's shadow. I was trying to create a new one that would finally allow me to step into the light. I didn't want to just be successful. I wanted to be seen, to be recognized, to be someone who mattered. And so, with each passing day, I pushed myself harder, determined to make a name for myself, to prove that I was more than just James Carter, Robert Carter's younger brother. I was James Carter, a student at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, a man with ambitions and dreams that were entirely my own. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was on the brink of greatness, standing at the edge of a world that was finally within my reach. I was ready to claim my place in it, to step out of the shadow that had defined me for so long, and to create a new path, one that was mine and mine alone. The first few months at UCL had been a whirlwind, and by now, I had established myself in both the academic and social spheres. I wasn't just another student. I was James Carter, the American with a chip on his shoulder and an insatiable drive to succeed. I felt like I had finally escaped my brother's shadow and was beginning to create one of my own. I met Henry Beaumont during an economics lecture. He was the sort of person who exuded an effortless charisma, with his neatly tailored blazer, perfectly coiffed hair, and a British accent that seemed almost too refined. We bonded over a shared interest in finance and a mutual disdain for the mundane aspects of student life. It wasn't long before Henry introduced me to Isabella Romano, a stunning woman with an equally impressive background. Isabella was the daughter of an Italian media mogul, and she had a sharp wit and confidence that left people hanging on her every word. Through Henry and Isabella, I was ushered into a new world. A world of exclusive events, lavish parties, and people who could buy and sell entire companies with a snap of their fingers. My first real taste of this world came when Henry invited me to a soirée at the Savoy Hotel, one of London's most prestigious venues. The Savoy was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The hotel's Art Deco interiors, with their polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers, made me feel as if I'd stepped back in time. It was a world of luxury and elegance, a far cry from the life I'd left behind in New York. As we entered the grand ballroom, I felt a surge of excitement. This was exactly the kind of life I had always dreamed of, one where I could mingle with celebrities, dine on the finest cuisine, and drink champagne that cost more than my tuition. The event was a charity gala, but it felt more like a celebration of wealth and power. Everywhere I looked, there were people who exuded an effortless confidence, people who had been born into privilege and wore it like a badge of honor. I met CEOs, politicians, and even a few actors whose faces were instantly recognizable. For the first time, I felt like I was part of a world that had always been just out of reach, a world that I was determined to make my own. It was at the Savoy that I met Edward Harrington, a venture capitalist with a reputation for taking risks and reaping the rewards. Edward was a tall man with sharp features and a piercing gaze that seemed to see right through people. He was exactly the kind of person I wanted to impress, the kind of person who could open doors that I hadn't even known existed. Henry introduced us, and we quickly fell into conversation about the world of finance, about investments, startups, and the importance of calculated risks. Edward seemed intrigued by my background, by the fact that I had come to London to make a name for myself, to escape the shadow of my older brother. "You've got ambition, James," he said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I like that. How would you feel about interning at my firm? We could use someone with your drive." I was taken aback, my heart racing with excitement. An internship at Harrington and Company. Investments was exactly the kind of opportunity one had been hoping for. It was a chance to prove myself, to gain experience in high-stakes finance, and to start building a network of connections that could take me to the top. "I'd be honored," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I won't let you down." And just like that, I found myself on the fast track, diving headfirst into the world of venture capital and high finance. The internship was intense, the hours long and the work demanding, but I thrived in the fast-paced environment. Edward was a tough mentor, but he was fair, and I quickly learned that he valued results above all else. He didn't care about where you came from or who you were, only what you could bring to the table. One of my first tasks at Harrington and Company was to prepare a pitch for a startup that had caught Edward's eye. It was a tech company specializing in AI-driven financial analytics, and Edward was convinced that it had the potential to disrupt the industry. He handed me a stack of documents, gave me a brief rundown of the company's strengths and weaknesses, and then left me to figure out the rest. I spent hours poring over the details, crafting a pitch that would highlight the company's unique selling points, its potential for growth, and the ways in which it could leverage its technology to dominate the market. When the day of the pitch arrived, I stood in front of a group of investors, my heart pounding as I presented my case. I could feel their eyes on me, could sense their skepticism, but I held my ground, confident in the research I had done and the arguments I had prepared. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, and then Edward spoke. "Thank you, James. That was impressive." He turned to the investors. "So, who's ready to put their money where their mouth is?" One of the investors raised a hand. "I'll start with £50,000. A rush of adrenaline surged through me. I had done it. I had secured an investment, proved my worth, and taken the first step towards a career that could finally set me apart from my brother. I was on my way, and I knew that this was only the beginning. As I immersed myself in my internship, Henry and Isabella continued to introduce me to the finer things in life. Henry lived in Knightsbridge, a neighborhood that was the epitome of wealth and exclusivity. He took me on a tour one day, showing me the mansions and penthouses that lined the streets, each one more extravagant than the last. "This is where the real power players live," Henry said, gesturing towards a sleek modern building that housed some of London's most luxurious penthouses. "These are the people who control the city, who shape its future. It's not just about money here. It's about influence, about who you know and how well you can play the game." I took it all in, feeling a sense of awe and determination. I wanted this life, wanted to be part of this world. I knew that it would take time, that I would have to prove myself again and again, but I was willing to do whatever it took. I was no longer content to be James Carter, the younger brother overshadowed by his older sibling. I wanted to be someone in my own right, someone who could command respect and admiration, someone who mattered. As the weeks went by, my confidence grew. I was no longer just an observer in this world. I was a participant, someone who could hold his own among the elite. I attended more exclusive events, dined at restaurants where a single meal cost more than a month's rent, and even found myself rubbing shoulders with celebrities and politicians. London had become my playground, a city of endless opportunities, and I was determined to make the most of it. I was building bridges, forming connections, and laying the groundwork for a future that was mine and mine alone. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally free of Robert's shadow, free to forge my own path and create my own legacy. And as I looked out over the city from the top floor of Harrington and Company, I knew that I was only just beginning. This was my world now, a world of wealth, power, and possibility, and I was ready to claim my place in it. Graduating from UCL with honors felt like a significant milestone, but I knew it was just the beginning of what I intended to accomplish. London had become my home, and I had no plans to leave. The city's energy, its allure, and the life I had built here were too intoxicating to give up. I was determined to carve out my place in this world, to build a legacy that was mine alone. And the opportunity to do just that arrived sooner than I had expected. Not long after graduation, I received a job offer from Barclays Investment Bank. The offer was generous, pound 120,000 per year, plus bonuses and other perks that made it impossible to refuse. Barclays was one of the top investment banks in the world, and the position came with a level of prestige and influence that fit perfectly with the life I had envisioned for myself. I accepted the offer and quickly threw myself into the role, working long hours and going above and beyond to prove myself. I learned the ins and outs of corporate finance, networked relentlessly, and absorbed everything I could from my superiors. I made it my mission to excel, to stand out, and to establish myself as someone who didn't just belong in this world, but who thrived in it. Within a year, my hard work began to pay off. I was given a significant promotion, along with a pay raise that left me with an annual salary well into the six figures. With my newfound success came new responsibilities, and I found myself attending corporate meetings, rubbing shoulders with top executives, and even pitching my ideas directly to senior management. The thrill of being recognized for my contributions, of knowing that I had earned my place at the table, was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I was no longer just a young man trying to escape his brother's shadow. I was James Carter, rising star in the world of finance. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally becoming the person I had always wanted to be. But I wasn't content to stop there. I wanted more, wanted to expand my horizons beyond the world of banking. That's when I started thinking about real estate, about the possibilities that lay in London's luxury property market. I had seen the kind of wealth that could be generated through real estate, and I was determined to make my mark in that world as well. Through Isabella, I had access to a network of luxury property developers and investors who were always on the lookout for new opportunities. We had often talked about the possibility of going into business together, and now, with my financial background and her connections, it seemed like the perfect time to make that a reality. We decided to invest in a high-end real estate project in Mayfair, one of London's most exclusive neighborhoods. The property was a beautiful Georgian townhouse, complete with grand archways, high ceilings, and an air of old-world elegance that was impossible to resist. We purchased it for £3 million, with plans to renovate it into a series of luxury apartments that would cater to the city's elite. The project was ambitious, but I was confident that it would pay off. Isabella and I spent weeks poring over designs, meeting with architects, and fine-tuning our vision for the property. We wanted to create something truly unique, something that would attract the kind of high-net-worth individuals who were willing to pay a premium for exclusivity and luxury. As the renovations progressed, I felt a sense of excitement that I hadn't felt in a long time. This was more than just a business venture. It was a chance to leave my mark on the city, to create something tangible that would stand as a testament to my success. I threw myself into the project with the same determination and drive that had carried me through UCL and Barclays, determined to make it a success. The media soon took notice of our project, and before I knew it, my name was appearing in business magazines and newspapers, alongside articles about the Mayfair property. I was no longer just an up-and-coming banker. I was a real estate investor, a businessman, someone who was making waves in the world of luxury property. The recognition felt surreal, a validation of everything I had worked for, and a sign that I had finally stepped out of my brother's shadow. The day my face appeared on the cover of London Business Weekly, I felt a rush of pride that was almost overwhelming. The article praised my achievements, detailing my rise from an overlooked younger brother to a successful entrepreneur who was making a name for himself in one of the most competitive cities in the world. I read the article over and over, savoring each word, each sentence that confirmed that I was finally being recognized for who I was, not just who I was related to. But with the recognition came a new level of scrutiny, a pressure to prove that my success wasn't just a fluke, that I had what it took to sustain it. The renovation project was nearing completion, and I knew that the next few months would be crucial. We had invested millions into the property, and I was determined to see a return on that investment that would solidify my reputation as a savvy businessman. I began reaching out to potential buyers, giving them private tours of the property, showcasing the sleek modern interiors that blended seamlessly with the townhouse's historic charm. The apartments were stunning, with marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and custom finishes that spoke to a level of luxury that was unmatched in the area. I knew that we were offering something special, something that would appeal to the city's wealthiest residents. As the offers began to come in, I felt a sense of exhilaration that reminded me of the early days at Barclays, when I had first realized that I had the power to shape my own destiny. We sold the apartments at a premium, and by the time the last unit had been signed over, we had made a profit of £1 million. It was a resounding success, a confirmation that I was capable of achieving greatness on my own terms. The media attention continued, and soon I was being invited to speak at conferences, to share my story with aspiring entrepreneurs who were eager to follow in my footsteps. I had become someone that people looked up to, someone whose success was no longer tied to his brother's accomplishments, but who stood on his own as a self-made man. London was no longer just a city to me. It was a stage, a platform from which I could continue to build, to expand, to push myself to new heights. I had tasted success, and I knew that I wanted more, that I was capable of more. I had built bridges, forged connections, and made a name for myself in a world that had once seemed out of reach. And as I looked out over the city from the rooftop of the Mayfair property, I knew that this was only the beginning. I had proven to myself, to my family, and to the world that I was more than just James Carter, the younger brother of a successful businessman. I was James Carter, a man who had taken control of his own destiny, who had built a life of wealth, power, and influence on his own terms. The shadow that had once loomed over me was gone, replaced by a legacy that was mine and mine alone. And as I prepared to take the next step, to continue building, expanding, and achieving, I felt a sense of purpose, a drive that I knew would carry me forward. I had made my mark on London, and I was only just getting started. In the days leading up to my return to New York, I had anticipated every detail of what my homecoming would look like. I imagined the expressions on my parents' faces when they saw how far I'd come. I thought about how I'd stand beside Robert, finally his equal, finally free from the feeling of inadequacy that had haunted me for so long. But nothing could have prepared me for the actual moment we sat down together, alone for the first time since I left. Robert had invited me to lunch at one of his favorite spots, a rooftop restaurant with sweeping views of Manhattan. I could see why he liked it. The city stretched out before us, vast and impressive, a testament to ambition and hard work, the kind of place where a person could feel on top of the world. As we took our seats, he seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my life in London, about the circles I moved in, and the projects I was working on. He listened, nodding thoughtfully, his expression one of admiration. For a moment, it felt as if we were simply two brothers catching up, sharing stories about the paths our lives had taken. We talked about my real estate investments, the business ventures I was exploring, and even some of the parties and events I had attended. I could tell that Robert was impressed, but there was something else there too, a hint of something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then, as our conversation began to wind down, Robert grew quiet, his gaze drifting out over the cityscape. "You know, James," he began, his tone contemplative, "I never thought you'd actually leave. When you told us you were going to London, I thought it was just a phase. I didn't think you'd actually go through with it." I leaned back, studying his face, trying to gauge the meaning behind his words. "I had to," I replied, my voice steady. "I needed to get out from under your shadow, to find out who I was on my own terms." He nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I can see that now. But back then, I thought it was just, well, I guess I thought it was just you being impulsive, trying to make a point. I didn't think you'd actually make something of yourself." His words stung, even though I knew he didn't mean them as a slight. It was simply the truth, an acknowledgement of the low expectations that had always lingered between us. I had been the younger brother, the one who could never quite measure up, the one who was always a step behind. But now, things were different, and I could see that Robert was finally beginning to understand that. "I know I was always the afterthought," I said, my voice calm but firm. I know I was always the one who wasn't supposed to succeed, but that's exactly why I had to leave. I had to prove to myself that I could do it, that I could be someone without you there, without everyone constantly comparing me to you. Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair as he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. James, it was never about you not measuring up. I know it felt that way, but it wasn't about you. It was about me, about the expectations I put on myself, the need to live up to what Dad expected of me. You got caught up in that, and I'm sorry. I was taken aback, my mind racing as I tried to process his words. This was a side of Robert the first had never seen before, a vulnerability that he had always kept hidden. He was the golden child, the one who had always seemed so self-assured, so confident. But now, I could see that beneath that facade was a man who had his own doubts, his own fears. You don't have to apologize, I said, my voice softening. I know you had your own pressures, your own challenges, but it felt like I was always playing second fiddle, like no matter what I did, it would never be enough. He nodded, his gaze steady as he met my eyes. I get that now. I should have done more to support you, to encourage you. But the truth is, I was so caught up in my own success, my own need to prove myself, that I didn't see how it was affecting you. I didn't realize that you needed space to grow, to find yourself. The words hung between us, a silent acknowledgement of the years we had spent in each other's orbit, yet never truly connecting. I felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting from my shoulders as I realized that this was what I had needed all along. Not just recognition, but understanding. I had spent so much time trying to escape Robert's shadow, to prove that I was more than just his younger brother, that I hadn't stopped to consider that he might have felt the same pressures I did. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the distant hum of the city and the clinking of dishes from the tables around us. I could feel the tension between us begin to dissolve, replaced by a sense of camaraderie, a bond that had been strained but never broken. So, what's next for you? Robert asked, his tone lighter now, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. I mean, you've got this great thing going in London. Are you planning on staying there, or are you thinking of coming back to New York? I shrugged, a smile spreading across my face as I thought about the possibilities. I don't know yet. I love London, but there's a part of me that feels like New York is still home. I've been thinking about expanding here, maybe investing in some property, starting a new venture. I want to see what I can build here. Now that I have a foundation, he nodded, a smile of his own appearing as he reached for his glass, raising it in a toast. To new ventures, then, and to finally stepping out of the shadows. I raised my glass, clinking it against his as I met his gaze. To new ventures, I echoed, feeling a surge of excitement as I looked out over the city that had once felt like a cage. Now, it felt like a place of endless possibilities, a city that was no longer defined by my brother's success, but by my own ambitions, my own dreams. As we finished our drinks, Robert leaned back, a thoughtful expression on his face. You know, James, I've always been proud of you. I may not have shown it, but I have. You've done something incredible, something that most people wouldn't have the courage to do. And I think you've proven, not just to me, but to everyone, that you're more than just my brother. You're your own man, and that's something to be proud of. I felt a lump form in my throat, a mixture of gratitude and relief that threatened to overwhelm me. For so long, I had yearned for his approval, had wanted him to see me as an equal, as someone who was worthy of respect. And now, here he was, telling me exactly what I had needed to hear, affirming that I had finally stepped out of his shadow and into my own light. Thanks, Robert, I replied, my voice thick with emotion. That means more than you know. We sat there for a while longer, reminiscing about our childhood, laughing about old memories, and sharing stories of our respective journeys. It felt like a turning point, a moment of reconciliation that had been a long time coming. We had both grown, both changed, and now, for the first time, we were able to see each other not as rivals, but as brothers, as equals. As we finally stood to leave, Robert clapped a hand on my shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. I'm glad you're back, James. I'm glad we had this chance to talk. Me too, I replied, feeling a sense of closure, of peace that I hadn't known was possible. I guess I'll see you around. He nodded, a grin spreading across his face as he turned to walk away. You will. And James, don't be a stranger. We're family, after all. I watched him go, a sense of satisfaction settling over me as I realized that I had finally achieved what I had set out to do. I had proven myself, not just to the world, but to Robert. I had found my own path, my own identity, and now I was free to build a life that was entirely my own. As I walked out onto the bustling streets of Manhattan, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to continue building, growing, and achieving. I was no longer defined by my brother's success, no longer trapped in his shadow. I was James Carter, a man who had claimed his own place in the world, who had earned the respect of his family, and who was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. The city stretched out before me, vast and full of possibilities, and as I took that first step forward, I knew that I was finally free. Returning to New York felt surreal. I hadn't been back since I left for London, since the day I had stepped onto a plane with a single suitcase and a determination to escape Robert's shadow. Now, I was returning as a man transformed, a man with a name, a career, and a legacy that were entirely my own. I was no longer just James Carter, the younger brother. I was James Carter, the successful businessman, the entrepreneur, the man who had built his own empire. As my plane touched down at JFK, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and nerves. I had come so far, achieved so much, and yet there was a part of me that wondered how my family would react. They had always seen me as the younger sibling, the one who couldn't quite live up to Robert's success. But now, I was returning as an equal, or perhaps even more. When I arrived at my parents' house, I was greeted with surprise and, dare I say, a hint of admiration. My father, always reserved, looked at me with something that might have been pride. My mother enveloped me in a hug, her eyes misting as she took in my appearance, the confidence I wore like a well-tailored suit. And then there was Robert. He looked much the same as he had when I left, still confident, still successful, still the golden child. But there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, a hint of curiosity that told me he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected me to return as someone who had carved out his own path, who had found success on his own terms. Well, look at you, Robert said, a grin spreading across his face as he pulled me into a hug. I heard you'd been doing well for yourself, but I didn't realize how well. I returned the grin, feeling a surge of satisfaction. It's been a good few years, I replied, keeping my tone casual. London's been good to me. As we sat down to catch up, I found myself telling him stories of my life in London, of the people I had met, the deals I had closed, the properties I had invested in. I told him about the Mayfair project, about the recognition I had received, about the article in London Business Weekly that had marked my official arrival in the world of successful entrepreneurs. For the first time, I saw a spark of genuine respect in Robert's eyes, a recognition that I was no longer the kid brother he had once overshadowed. That's impressive, James, he said, nodding thoughtfully. It sounds like you've really made a name for yourself. I have, I replied, meeting his gaze. I've built something that's mine, something that isn't tied to anyone else's success. We talked late into the night, reminiscing about the past, sharing stories of our respective journeys. It was strange, this new dynamic between us. For the first time, I felt like we were equals, like I was finally someone Robert could see as a peer rather than just his younger brother. It was a feeling I had chased for so long, and now that I had it, it felt more satisfying than I could have ever imagined. The next day, I began laying the groundwork for the next chapter of my life, expanding my business to New York. I had built a solid foundation in London, but I knew that New York was where I wanted to establish my next foothold. This city was where it had all begun, and now I was ready to return, not as an escapee, but as a conqueror. I found a luxury condominium in Manhattan, a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city skyline. The price tag was steep, $5 million, but it was a statement, a declaration of the success I had achieved and the life I was building. I closed the deal, feeling a rush of satisfaction as I signed the papers, solidifying my place in the city that had once felt like a prison. The Manhattan condo became my new headquarters, a space where I could host meetings, entertain clients, and plan my next moves. I began reaching out to contacts in New York, setting up meetings, exploring investment opportunities, and laying the groundwork for a new phase of my career. I was determined to make my mark on this city, to establish myself as a force to be reckoned with, not just in London, but in New York as well. To celebrate this new chapter, I decided to throw a lavish party at the condo, inviting friends from London, my family, and new connections I had made in New York. I wanted to mark the occasion, to celebrate not just my return, but my transformation, my journey from the shadow of my brother's success to the pinnacle of my own. The night of the party arrived, and the condo was filled with the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the laughter of people who had come to celebrate my success. Isabella flew in from London, as did Henry, and together we raised a toast to the journey we had shared, the memories we had made, and the future that lay ahead. Robert was there, too, mingling with the guests, a proud smile on his face as he introduced me to his friends, his colleagues. It was a strange but satisfying feeling, seeing him in my space, surrounded by people who knew me as more than just his brother. I was James Carter, a man who had built his own empire, who had earned his place in the world of wealth and influence. As the night wore on, I stood by the windows, looking out over the city that had once felt like a cage, a place I had been desperate to escape. Now, it felt like a stage, a platform from which I could continue to build, to expand, to push myself to new heights. I had come full circle, returning to New York not as a man trying to prove himself, but as a man who had already succeeded, who had already made his mark. The party continued late into the night, and as I looked around at the faces of the people who had become part of my journey, I felt a sense of fulfillment, a sense of peace that I had never known before. I had finally stepped out of Robert's shadow, had finally proven to myself and to the world that I was more than just a younger brother. I was a man in my own right, a man who had built a life, a legacy, and a name that were entirely his own. As the last of the guests left, I stood alone in the quiet of the condo, looking out over the city lights, feeling a sense of gratitude for everything I had accomplished. I had come a long way, had faced challenges, doubts, and fears, but I had emerged stronger, more determined, and more successful than I had ever imagined. The shadow that had once loomed over me was gone, replaced by a light that was entirely my own. I was James Carter, a man who had built his own empire, who had claimed his own success, and who was ready to continue building, to continue growing, to continue pushing the limits of what was possible. I had finally returned to New York, but this time, it was on my terms, with my own identity, my own success, and my own future. I was no longer just a man in the shadow of greatness. I was greatness itself. And as I stood there, looking out over the city that had once held me captive, I knew that I was ready for whatever lay ahead. The journey was far from over, but I was ready to face it, to embrace it, and to continue building a life that was truly and completely my own.